All right, good morning and welcome to our presentation with Dr. Jessica Brown. We're pleased to have her here today. I'm going to let her go ahead and introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I am Jessica Young Brown. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist stationed in the Richmond area. And so I have kind of two areas of work that I engage in. The primary area actually is providing faith-based counseling and faith-based consultation to faith communities, particularly communities who identify as Black or African American. And so I tell people that my clinical specialty is Black church folks. And so Black church folks really taught me about generational trauma. So the second area of work that I have is around generational trauma, particularly in African Americans, and then race equity and diversity work in mental health care systems. So in addition to being in private practice, I serve as faculty at Virginia Union University and also do some community-based work on boards. I'm primarily affiliated with the Henrico Area Mental Health Community Services Board and also with some other agencies. And so really my work largely focuses on how do we understand the systemic factors that impact the way people engage in the mental health system, and then how do we make mental health systems equitable and accessible to everyone who wants to access them. So this is really the vein through which I began to research and understand generational trauma in African Americans, and particularly how it shows up in mental health practice, and have been doing some talks and trainings with community services boards around the state on that for a while. And as many of you know, in the past 6 months, as we've been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and dealing with racial injustice and uprising in this country, what we've seen is really an exacerbation of those systemic factors that impact the way people enter and engage with not just the mental health system, but the larger health system in general. And so that really will be the focus of the conversation that we have today. I will be keeping an eye on the Q&A, so I don't feel like you have to wait until the end of the discussion to ask questions. I'll engage with you as much as we can. And then if you use the Q&A instead of the chat, that'll help us to kind of make sure that we track and respond to everyone's questions as they come. So I look forward to engaging with you all on today, and let's get started. I believe when you get the evaluation, you will also get a PDF version of these slides. Often people ask for the slides, so I'll say that up front, that you'll have access to that if you so desire. Okay, so let's get started. We are going to focus our time today on intergenerational trauma and the dual pandemic. When we say the dual pandemic, essentially what we're talking about is the combination of COVID-19 and racism, right? And so, of course, we know that racism is not a new thing. It's not a new pandemic, but the sort of recent events that have happened in our country around increased attention to not just racism in general, but interactions, particularly between unarmed Black folks and other folks of color and police, and how those things kind of get perpetrated in the different systems in our country have risen to the surface all at the same time. There was also very quickly an awareness that people of color, and particularly Black folks, were disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 virus. And so we'll talk about all of those in the context of this larger scope of generational trauma. Okay, so I want to do some definitions around generational trauma. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term trauma. The term that I use in my, the kind of colloquial term that I use in my clinical practice is trauma is something that happened that wasn't supposed to happen, or that didn't happen that was supposed to happen, right? And so when we think about the way trauma impacts an individual, we think about it as a disturbance of one's sense of safety that really produces an overwhelming response that takes over the mind and the body. So when we think about typical trauma reactions, we think about thought processes, we think about physiological processes getting interrupted, right? Sleep problems, hypervigilance, all those kinds of things. We also think about that the trauma has a lasting impact on people, right? That it shapes the way they view the world moving forward. And so, if we expand that definition to talk about generational trauma, essentially we're talking about communal level trauma, a traumatic event or experience that happens to a large group, often a cultural or national group, as opposed to one individual person. And when we think about generational trauma as a construct, it really is about the transmission of these traumatic experiences um, through both active and passive processes. And so, as those processes and those traumatic experiences are passed down over time, both the trauma and the effects of the trauma become ingrained both in the psyche and in familial patterns. Now, let me just say, we're going to talk specifically about generational trauma in African Americans. Black folks do not own generational trauma, right? We see generational trauma playing out in lots of different communities. So you can think about just in America, folks of Native American descent, right? Folks of African descent. We think about people who are Holocaust survivors, people who have ancestors who've experienced the Great Depression, right? So the idea, though, is that there's this communal event that occurs that really shapes the way a community responds to the world and responds to in-group members of that community. The key here, though, is that the reactions that people engage in as a response to the trauma may or may not be explicitly connected to the trauma itself. What I mean by that is people in a community might not just say, hey, we do this because we experienced this traumatic event, right? So I have a 5-year-old son. The first time he flies on an airplane, when he has to take off his shoes and go through the scanner and put all the stuff in the bin, I might not actively say to him, son, we have to do all these things because in September of 2001, there was this attack that happened in New York City and it impacted our country in the following ways, right? But the message I do send to him is, this is something we need to do to stay safe, right? And so that's why generational trauma can be passed down through both active and passive processes. The message that gets sent is, we do this because we need to, we do this to stay safe, but we don't always explicitly connect it to whatever the traumatic event is. And so one of the challenges that we'll talk about when we get to the point where we're ready to talk about what does it mean to heal or respond to generational trauma is telling the truth about the trauma that we're reacting to. Okay, so let's talk specifically about generational trauma in African Americans. Most folks of African descent who are here in the US, of course not all, but most folks who are here in the US who are of African descent are descendants of folks who were enslaved in this country. So we have the process of the transatlantic slave trade. We have a couple hundred years of chattel slavery. And then in 1865, when the Civil War is over, everyone is free. Hooray, it's over, right? Well, not exactly. The systems that were in place at that time in this country, while slavery was officially ended as a practice, the beliefs that allowed whole groups of people of African ancestry to be enslaved and counted as property for hundreds of years persisted and continue to persist to this day, right? So the reason that we have something like talking about a Jim Crow era, or the reason that we have systemic oppression and systemic racism in a country like the United States is because those beliefs are actually embedded into the founding of the country, right? When the founding fathers were writing documentation in beautiful flowery language about all men are created equal, those same people were enslaving other people who they considered property at the same time, right? And so part of what we need to talk about is that racism and systemic oppression are actually embedded into the systems of our country, because those are the things that were occurring when the country was founded. And so we see systematic oppression playing out in economic ways, in political venues, and in social disenfranchisement. So when Black folks began to try to vote, there were poll taxes, there were deterrents. When Black folks began to try to buy houses, there was redlining, there was discrimination in the banking industry, right? And that's something that we're still tackling today, even with even as we sort of move toward what could be considered a more equitable society. We do not live in the post-racial America that some people would like to say that we live in. And so when those kinds of systematic issues play out, what happens is that the trauma tends to recreate itself, right? And revive itself. So for those of you who identify as mental health professionals, let's say you have someone who's experienced sexual violence or sexual trauma, right? One of the things you would encourage them to do is to stay away from the person who perpetrated that violence, or to build some clear boundaries to maintain safety. Well, in a country where you're talking about systemic oppression, you can't always stay away from that which perpetrated the violence against you, right? Especially if you think about a state like Virginia, where plantations are places where people get married and they're tourist attractions, and on every corner we have a Confederate statue or a marker that memorializes something that happened in the Civil War, right? It's important to remember history, of course, but I can't just separate myself from the awareness that this trauma occurred. And in fact, in America, instead of acknowledging that the trauma occurred, what we often do is kind of gaslight people and tell them that was a long time ago. Why are you still talking about that? Right? In the mental health field, we know that that's not an appropriate way to respond to trauma. But from a social and political perspective, that is often what we do in this country to people who are in marginalized communities, is we say, look, get over it. You have your rights now. You're an American, you're living the American dream, you need to move forward, right? But if we consider it as a trauma, right, we know that that's exactly the opposite of what people need. And so often people who are in these marginalized communities have to act to protect themselves because they're embedded in a community that refuses to protect them because it does not own that a trauma has occurred. And so one of the things that we see very often is people build this deep mistrust for that which is other, and they build insular communities where the kind of rules and regulations in those communities are firm to act as a protective mechanism against that other, which could be harmful or dangerous. So Vamik Volkan was a sociologist who actually studied Holocaust survivors. And I think this definition and framework for intergenerational trauma, is so poignant. So I wanted to share it with you all. When a whole society has undergone massive trauma, victimized adults may endure guilt and shame for not having protected their children. The byproduct of such trauma is a perennial collective mourning over the loss of group dignity, self-esteem, and identity. The mourning is characterized by conscious and unconscious communications, passed down to generations in an attempt to mourn the group's losses and remove the collective sense of victimization. And so the key here that we're going to talk about, specifically when we talk about these behavioral patterns when we think about generational trauma, is that no matter what they look like on the surface, all trauma reactions are attempts to mourn, attempts to protect, attempts to heal. And they may not have that outcome in the present moment, but the intention behind the behavior is one that is protective, right? If I'm talking to a group of clinical supervisees, what I'll say is all trauma reactions have good intentions, right? And so it's important for us to, in many ways, when we're talking about folks who may have experienced generational trauma, suspend the judgment that we sometimes have about what constitutes a dysfunctional behavior and think about what is the goal of that behavior. Well, the goal of that behavior is to mourn, is to heal, is to protect, right? And so when we think about it from that lens, we can understand how naming the trauma actually helps us to get more sophisticated in our understanding of these behaviors and to figure out a way forward. So let's talk for a minute about the dual pandemic, and then we'll talk about some specific behavioral factors that we see around generational trauma. So one of the things that came up very early as we're dealing with this COVID-19 pandemic is that Black folks, people of color in general, but Black folks in particular, seemed to be disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And so the sort of immediate response to that was this blaming thing that we do very well, right? Well, Black people don't take care of themselves. They don't go to the doctor. They're not as healthy, right? It's their fault. We're great at that. Let's go a level deeper and think about systemic oppression and how it functions. So first, we have to tackle the issue of inequity in the health system. African Americans as a demographic group are much more likely to be uninsured or underinsured. They are much less likely to have positive, trusting relationships with medical providers. They are much more likely to live in neighborhoods where they have less access to appropriate medical care. And they are also much more likely to be employed in positions where they don't have the option of working from home or teleworking, right? Or logging onto Zoom or Microsoft Teams to do their work. They're much more likely to have to put themselves at physical risk in order to work. And because of the financial inequities that we talked about a moment ago, they're also much less likely to even be able to take time off when they're feeling sick. Right. In addition to, and frankly, fueling these larger issues of health inequity is the fact that African Americans have a complicated history with the medical system here in the US. There have been specific documented incidences where, for instance, the Tuskegee experiment, right? Where African Americans believed they were receiving treatment and instead were used as guinea pigs in a study that they didn't know anything about. And we see that mistrust even playing out as these medical trials are going on for the COVID-19 vaccine. I believe it was maybe about a week ago, two HBCU presidents, for those who are not familiar with that term, HBCU means historically Black college or university, right? So two presidents of predominantly Black colleges put out a joint statement saying that they had received a COVID-19 vaccine as a part of a clinical trial and were encouraging other folks of African descent to participate in these trials, right? From a medical perspective, it's necessary to have Black folks in the trials because we know that Black people are a group that is affected by COVID-19, and we really need to figure out what's happening there. The issue, though, is that the track record of Black people being treated well in medical trials is not stellar. And so depending on what community you're in, what you might have seen was people saying, no, we're not going to be the first ones to take this experimental vaccine. Maybe we are the ones who are seen as expendable. In fact, some of the stuff I saw going around was essentially how much were these people paid, right? So we see immediately that mistrust of medical systems. And it could be easy to paint that as some kind of paranoia or as being irrational. But the reality is, it is a response to historical fact. These things happened, right? And so it's a double-edged sword, because if I've been traumatized, I move to protect myself because I don't know if I can trust everyone's intentions. But it also means that people who are in this category, right? And here we have to name race as a social construct, right? When we talk about Blackness, we're probably also talking about this constellation of societal factors that Black folks are more likely to experience. And so we had to name that. But at the same time, in some ways, it puts trials back that we don't have the appropriate diversity in the trials. That's a double-edged sword. And so we say, oh, well, these people just aren't participating in the process. But at the end of the day, trauma reactions have good intentions, right? And so that's one example of how we see this dual pandemic impacting, intersecting with generational trauma. And we'll talk about that a little more. The second dynamic related to this dual pandemic is racism and race-related stress. So I believe it was around Memorial Day, maybe, that we first started hearing conversations about Ahmaud Arbery, who had been killed a month before. We heard about Breonna Taylor. We heard about George Floyd. There have been people who have, or their stories of their deaths have come to the forefront in the months since then. And so every maybe 6 months or so, right, we have this smattering of deadly interactions with police where a person died. They it might have been filmed. There's doubt about why they died. And very quickly we see two things happening. On one side of things, we see a rush of people who are advocating for police often to be held accountable. And on the other side, we see a rush of people defending police action and naming all the reasons why that person should have died, right? And so there's this scouring of the person's record to determine all the things they've done in the past that could have warranted this killing, right? It's a script that we're used to at this point. So that is there. One of the things that's happened now is I think we are talking about race both more openly and in a more divided way in this country in the past few years. And so the conversation has both heightened in the sense that the length and consistency of the protests has been different than what we've seen. And I think we're also seeing more attention and more action from government agencies related to these issues. So the one piece is, one of the things we'll talk about when we talk about generational trauma is a persistent lack of safety, right? And so this awareness that these kinds of interactions happen and are a part of our cultural reality reaffirm the idea that for some people, the world is not safe and we need to protect ourselves. The other piece that sometimes people don't often think about is the vicarious trauma that occurs with social media and the 24-hour news cycle. It's not normal to constantly rewatch videos of people looking like you getting killed in the street. It's just not normal. It's not healthy. It's not helpful. And so it reaffirms those traumatic experiences, but also produces a new trauma of not only have people who look like me historically not been safe in this country, but they're not safe even now. And I'll give you some examples of kind of how that shows up in everyday existence, right? The thing that often exacerbates that sense of awareness that many people of color walk around with is the simultaneous cultural conversation that invalidates the realities of people who've experienced racism, right? So you get accused of playing the race card or race baiting, or why do people have to make everything about race, right? And even people who are well-intentioned, who would love to live in the post-racial world that we do not have, that is idealistic, will say things like, well, I don't see color, or we're all just a part of the human race, right? And on its surface, that could seem like something that is supportive or validating. But when you're talking with someone who really has experienced racism and oppression on a daily basis, what it actually sounds like is the thing that you're saying has happened to you is invalid. And it's something personal about you that you're seeing race in this situation where it's really not about race, right? Even the desire to have objective conversations on social media, right, often doesn't go very well because people by nature are not objective. Our experiences, our beliefs, our perspectives are colored by the way we move in the world. And so when you're talking about people who've experienced racism or oppression, that shows up in all of their interactions, whether they intend it to or not. So when we have these conversations that really validate what is reality for many folks, again, it's rehearsing, exacerbating the trauma. It's picking at a scab that has been trying to heal. All right, so let's talk about some component parts of generational trauma. I want to say here that I am standing on the shoulders of a social worker named Joy DeGruy-Leary, who just does a fantastic job talking about generational trauma in African Americans. She wrote a book, which, if this is even moderately interesting to you, you should read. Like, pull out your phone now, go to your Amazon account, purchase it, called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And she does an excellent job outlining how the historical trauma that folks of African descent experienced shows up in present day awareness of racism and race-related stress in Black folks. So I encourage you to check out her book. So there's a question. Based on the explanations you just gave, what's an appropriate way to respond to the All Lives Matter argument? Yes, so my response to this All Lives Matter argument is, yes, all lives do matter, but we haven't demonstrated that consistently as a country, right? And so if all lives matter, then at some times it means that we need to respond in crisis mode to particular groups who are not getting to live into that reality, right? I've seen, different things going around on social media. It's like, if one house is on fire and the fire truck shows up to that house and people in the neighborhood say, but what about my house? The simple response is, well, that house isn't on fire. And so I think it's important to really think about, in some ways, how our own individual privilege gets in the way of people being able to see the need that someone else has. There's a question about the name of the book, so I'm going to post it again in the Q&A section, and it's also in the reference section, so you'll have access to it. Thank you, Glencore. All right, so I think one of the things, frankly, that gets in the way of our ability to understand and respond to these issues, particularly for those of us who do not identify as Black or do not identify in that particular marginalized community, is this sense that we in some ways become blinded by our own privilege. And frankly, I think that's a function of um, we live in a very individualistic society, right? And so the American dream is embedded in that idea. Um, there's another great book, I can't think of the author right now, that really kind of attack might be a strong word, but critiques the idea of the American dream, called There Will Be No Miracles Here. Um, but anyway, the American dream is based on this idea of grit, individualism, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, hard work equals success, right? And so if you are an active participant in that framework, then it makes sense that you would believe that when people experience challenges, that is somehow their own doing. It's their fault, right? And if you think about the way we function as a country, we do that in lots of different areas, right? We do it with folks who are homeless. We do it with folks who are experiencing poverty. We do it with folks who have experienced job loss, right? And so our frame as Americans is often do it yourself. So it makes sense then when we're talking about addressing the whole community that might need help or support, or even just need a country to bear witness to its pain. We don't really have a frame for what that looks like in the cultural fabric of our country, right? And so it's easier for those of us who are outside to look at those people over there and say, well, this is all they're doing. It's something they did. And, you know, I think there's lots of work to do there that maybe is a whole other issue. How do we respond to this white privilege that continues to grow in society and feel equal as a Black nation? I'm not sure I'm understanding your question, but I'll try. So I think the how we respond to white privilege, again, is telling the truth. And it's also about us being able to recognize that for any of us, our perspective is our own. It's shaped by our own experiences. And particularly those of us who are in positions of privilege, which isn't just about race, right? Privilege is a multifaceted dynamic. Think about Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, right? Um, the goal, I think, is to consider perspectives that are not your own, and to challenge yourself, frankly, to build an awareness that I could have lived a whole life that feels full to me without considering how other people move through the world. And the truth is, most of us haven't, right? And so things like this are an attempt to do that. Okay, how do people compare BLM to KKK? I think that's interesting. I don't necessarily understand that comparison. The Ku Klux Klan is decidedly about white supremacy, which I think is different from any particular cultural group asking for equity and justice. What I think it boils down to perhaps is a fundamental misunderstanding of what certain social and political groups are about. And frankly, some people are highly invested in misunderstanding a group rather than getting to know what they're really about, right? So regarding trauma, I've recently engaged my agency in promoting more trauma-informed practices, specifically with how we address temperature checks. I have explained that having a uniformed officer using a temperature, quote, gun and pointing at an individual's head can be triggering. Have you seen, heard, or know of any challenges related to this? That's an interesting point that I hadn't thought about. I haven't seen anything related to that. In the reference section, there is a document from the CDC on COVID and racial inequity. And I think there's a piece in that addresses essentially how to address COVID risk and also understand how racial inequity complicates those things. So that could be something to consider. That's an interesting point. I I think the key too is making sure that we have people at the table who can respond to the variety of experiences that we want to attend to. This is especially the case for those of us who are in the mental health field, especially if you're working in a community mental health, because those agencies, not necessarily the staff, but certainly the folks receiving services at those agencies, are inherently diverse. And so it means that you have to have people who are constantly on the pulse of what it means for people to show up in all the ways they show up. And so maybe that means diversifying our practices. Maybe it means giving people options, right? So if someone doesn't want a temperature gun shot at their head, is there another way to check that they're safe to enter a building? Right? And so I think those kinds of things are a start. Okay, some Christians have expressed that Black Lives Matter should not be followed because the founders have added to the tenets of the organization some LGBTQ plus components. When you say the name, how do you suggest that Black Christians address, especially if the church has white leadership? Ooh, okay, so I'm gonna give a short answer here because we could do a whole Q&A and I'll never finish the slides. My short answer is, I think we are at a point politically, socially, morally, that we have to focus on the big picture. And often, Black Christians in particular, but Christians in general, become distracted by our legalism. And we forget sort of the main tenets of what Christianity is. So at the end of the day, I think you have to vote your conscience. You should only engage with organizations that match your values in meaningful ways. But I think we sometimes become caught up in things that are not the main issue. And from a perspective of responding to generational trauma, from my perspective, it is, Fannie Lou Hamer's words, I'm not free until all of us are free. And so as a Black person, simply because I'm cisgendered and straight and happen to have a husband and 2 kids and a house in the burbs, that doesn't mean that I get to dismiss other Black people's experiences who aren't like mine. So that's my personal frame. But again, I want to make clear that that's my personal frame. And I think it's an issue that Christendom in general will have to tackle as we think about what it means to have faith-based responses to social injustice, and what is the call of the church to respond to those things. Good questions. Okay, so when we think about behavioral kind of strategies or indicators of generational trauma in African Americans, I want to draw your attention to 3 main patterns. The first is persistent lack of safety. The second is emotional cutoff or emotional devaluation. The third is what I'm calling opportunity deficit. And I want to say again, because it's critically important, what this is really a reworking and kind of a paraphrase of Joy DeGruy Leary's work, but she is the source for this information. So certainly check out her work. And these patterns are all fueled by what we've been discussing, which is systematic oppression and disenfranchisement. Okay, so I'm not gonna talk about systemic oppression again, because I think we've done a sufficient job, excuse me, I think we've done a sufficient job addressing that in our preceding conversation. Let's get directly to persistent lack of safety. So as I said a minute ago, particularly related to videos or images of deadly interactions with police and unarmed Black folks in particular, we have to dismiss this idea that what we're seeing is cultural paranoia. My son, I shared with you, I have a young son. My husband is a CNN junkie, and my husband had gone somewhere, and my son was in the family room, and there was footage on CNN. It shows how persistently this occurs, that at this point I cannot remember who the person was who had been shot, but the CNN anchor was talking about this deadly police force of this unarmed person, and my son looks at me and says, "Mommy, the police shot him?" And I said, "Yes, honey, the police shot him." And he says, "Police aren't supposed to do that. Police are supposed to keep you safe. That's not nice." He's 4. He'll be 5 in November, right? And so I had this moment of, what's my responsibility as a parent in this moment, right? I have a young son who isn't going to be driving anywhere for a while, who I don't want to necessarily poison against police, because of course all police aren't bad. We know that, right? But at the same time, at some point, I'm also aware that my husband and I will have to have a conversation about what it will mean for him as a Black boy to interact with police. That's not paranoia. It is my responsibility as a parent to help my son understand the world he lives in. And so, for the vast majority of African Americans in this country, it is not as simple as the world is mostly a safe place, because that depends. It depends on what you look like. It depends on how big you are. It depends on what neighborhood you live in, right? There are all of these other factors that influence that. And Joy DeGruy-Leary talks about how this lack of safety comes from, and is, it essentially was born from, the ever-present reality that during enslavement, you or a family member could be snatched away at any given point. And so you don't let your kids wander too far. You don't let them stay out after the street lights are on. You don't paint the rosy image that you'll be fine because the world is safe, because the reality is that depending on who you are and where you are, the world is not safe, right? And those of us who love our CBT interventions, one of the common core beliefs that we try to reframe is this idea that the world is unsafe. But what if that's not true, right? And so again, it relates to, how do I understand a person's cultural reality and not dismiss who they are, because from my perspective, the world is safe. If you add the financial and social resources issues that people who identify as Black are more likely to experience, right? We're disproportionately impacted by poverty, disproportionately living in communities that are unsafe, right? This idea that the world is just a safe place, period, is simply not true. And it doesn't jive with the world that we know and the world that we live in. Leary provides this really poignant example of 2 moms and small kids in a bank, and there's like a white mother and a Black mother. And the white child is kind of exploring the bank, doing what kids do. She's walking around, she's talking to people, she's playing in the plants. The Black child is standing beside her mother, sort of watching this white child interact with the world. And it's almost as if she looks up to her mother for permission, and the mother gives her the look, capital T, capital L-O-O-K, the look, which means some variation of, you better not, don't you move, I dare you, right? And so Leary talks about that it's not as if the Black mother doesn't want her child to experience the world, right? But the Black mother, Latanya says she knows about the look. We all do. When I do this training in person, there's raucous laughter when I say the look, right? But it's not as if the Black mother wants to constrict her child's world. It's not as if She wants her child to have the sense that some parts of this America are inaccessible to her. But she knows that her child doesn't get the same liberties that another child would, right? Her child doesn't get the same freedom. And maybe that mom doesn't actually say, because maybe it's not in her active awareness, right? Passive and active processes, that her assessment at that time is due to their Blackness. But the message the kid gets is the world is unsafe. Don't go too far. Don't do too much. Don't spread your wings too much because you could get your hand slapped, right? And if that message gets passed in intentional and unintentional ways over the course of a lifespan, imagine how that shows up as an adult, right? Those parents who say later in life, well, maybe you should pick a profession that will just get you a paycheck so you can have stability. Or you need to be able to support yourself. So you shouldn't do that because that's not a guarantee. Those parents aren't trying to kill their children's spirits. They're trying to protect them. All trauma reactions have good intentions. They're attempts to heal, to mourn, to protect, right? The insidiousness of generational trauma is that we don't always connect it to the trauma, but we're still engaged in the attempts to heal. So a couple months ago, maybe it had to be more than 6 months ago now because I've been in the house for 6 months, maybe 8 months ago now. I had rented a car to go do a consultation with the Community Services Board up in Northern Virginia, and my husband was at home. My husband is the kind of person who's like always checking the tires on the cars, and he's the maintenance person. So anyway, he calls me. I'm on the road in my rental car, and he says, someone stole the registration sticker off your license plate. And I say, oh, well, I'll have to go to the DMV and get a new one. And he says, you need to be really careful. Like, until we get this fixed, you either need to consider keeping this rental car, or you need to go to the DMV as soon as you can on Monday. And until you get it fixed, you need to take your registration and your driver's license and put them in the driver's side compartment of your door so you can access it easily. You need to make sure, you're driving the speed limit, stop at the stop sign, like do everything you need to do. You need to be squeaky clean until you get this straight. And I had this thought of, dude, why are you doing all this? Like, it doesn't have to be. And I was literally in the midst of telling him that he was overreacting. And he stops me and he says, listen, excuse me, I'm a Black man. I just need you to trust me. Right? So something to me that was just as simple as, oh, go to the DMV and get new tags. For him, it was this very keen awareness that until I got this thing fixed, I was exponentially more at risk, right? The world was not safe for me because not only can interactions with police be dangerous as a Black person, but now I would be in the wrong if I didn't have these registration tags, right? And so that's the kind of thing that fuels the idea of persistent lack of safety, right? And we actually had a conversation about it later, and we both had this awareness that as we were having the conversation, both of us were experiencing this physiological arousal, right? This anxiety and fear response that just comes in a moment when you have this active awareness, I'm not safe. And so imagine if you spend your whole life walking around with this awareness that you're not safe. Number one, you're hypervigilant because your body needs you to be hypervigilant. But number two, we also know from a health perspective that if you have constant physiological reactivity in the body, that leads to issues with chronic illnesses. And so it would be easy to say, well, the reason that Black folks are at higher risk for things like hypertension or diabetes or cardiovascular issues is simply because they make poor lifestyle choices and they don't go to the doctor. But in reality, we've got lots of evidence that suggests that racism and race-related stress is one of the main culprits for these health inequities. When you're walking around with a heightened physiological response, with an active sympathetic nervous system that's constantly in fight or flight mode, it's harder for you to stay healthy. It just is, right? And so again, it's not just about the cognitive and emotional experiences that go along with trauma, but now we're also talking about the physical and physiological indicators of dealing with that trauma on a daily basis and the consequences of that. The next component is opportunity deficits. So many of the Black folks in particular, but certainly lots of people of color, have heard some version of you have to work twice as hard to get half as far, right? We can see in-group competition. Black people are often accused by other Black folks, in fact, of being, quote, crabs in a barrel, right? That we sort of work against each other and sort of working instead of working together. What we fail to realize is that crabs in a barrel are on their way to death. And so they're in fight or flight mode, right? And so again, the sentiment behind this opportunity deficit framework is all of us won't make it. And so either I have to grind myself to death, I have to work twice as hard, I have to be perfect in order to achieve, or maybe I might have to step on other people along the way, right? And so sometimes the racial socialization that you'll end up seeing in Black families is almost a dismissiveness or an ambivalence to accomplishments. Oh, I got straight A's. Yeah, that's what you were supposed to do, right? And again, it's not as if Black parents just want to dismiss their children, but in a framework where mediocrity isn't enough, excellence is the only way to success, then you might see that playing out. DeGruy Leary also makes the point that if we think about the historical reality of chattel slavery, then a parent who openly celebrates their child's accomplishments might see that child get taken away from them for those very same accomplishments. And so the investment might be to actually downplay a person's experiences and accomplishments rather than lifting them up. Again, without thinking about what the long-term consequences for that might be down the road. And so we see that in our own families, we see it in our assessment of other Black folks, right? That African Americans also participate in anti-Blackness. And often we don't realize what we're doing because it is a trait that has been passed down actively and passively, right, over time. And it's sometimes outside of our conscious awareness. Many of you might be familiar with the term token, right, which is using one person to represent a whole. Well, what we know about cultural differences is that most people, within group differences are typically larger than between group differences. No group is a monolith. And so anytime you ask one person to represent the whole, there are two consequences. Number one, you put inordinate pressure on the person who is the token. You set up competition between the token and the other members of their community. And number two, you don't actually get the full experience of people who are part of that community because no token can adequately represent the whole, right? It is, tokenism is performative. It's to say, oh, we have somebody here. It's the person who, upon being accused of engaging in something racist, says, but I have a Black friend. Congratulations, right? That doesn't mean that you are not engaged in anti-Blackness. And so, again, we see the message that gets sent is, this world wasn't made for you. So you have to work hard if you're going to get there. And we're not going to coddle you because the world won't coddle you. The challenge there is everybody needs a home base. Everybody needs a safe space. And so if that can't be at home, where's the likelihood that I will find it? The next component, emotional devaluation or emotional cutoff. So you are likely to, again, we're talking generalities. Of course, this isn't all Black people, but you're likely to see emphasis on physical over emotional or relational needs. So the sense is, oh, Glencoy, thank you for addressing that. And Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality. I'll talk about it a little bit when we talk about some remedies, but yes, the September 25th training will go into more detail. So a focus on physical needs over emotional or relational needs. The sense that if you have clothes on your back, if you have food on the table, if you have a place to live, no need to complain, right? I don't care about your little feelings. And again, if you think about it in terms of the historical reality of Black folks in this country, for generations and generations, Black people were unlikely to have, as my grandmother would say, a pot to piss in. And so in that context, yeah, feelings are kind of low on the totem pole if what I really need to think about is where will I sleep and what will I eat. And a point here that I usually make earlier that I just want to say, we're talking about intersectionality and the different privileges that we all have. Often, Blackness in this country in particular gets conflated with poverty. And the reality is we are disproportionately impacted by poverty. But even if you've sort of come up, that doesn't mean you are not dealing with the vestiges of generational trauma. So you look at somebody like me, I have a PhD, my husband has a master's degree, we have a nice house in the suburbs with a 2-car garage, we drive 2 nice cars, our kids have college savings plans, right? On the surface, we've made it, right? We're upwardly mobile. We have education and liquid assets and those kinds of things, right? My grandmother, so 2 generations ago, my mother's mother could not read. She was illiterate. And she and my grandfather were sharecroppers until they were able to purchase their home, which was a huge deal for them. It was such a big deal, in fact, that in the city where my grandmother resided, the street that her house was on is named after our family because it was such a big deal that they were able to buy property, right? And she began her time on that land as a sharecropper who could not read. And so it would be foolish of me to think, because I've made it personally, that I am divorced from the history of my family or that I'm not impacted by racism, right? Because no matter where I show up, I still show up as a Black woman. And I'll give you another example of that in a minute, right? I still show up as someone who has to tackle the realities of racism. I cannot be separated from that, no matter how hard I try. And we do ourselves a disservice if we believe the argument that I'm free from it and I don't have to deal with that. Thank you for presenting this informative information. I think as being a parent, we have to be more aware of their safety. Oh, absolutely, it's true. I'm not saying that parents being aware of their children's safety is a bad thing. I think it's a good thing and it's necessary, right? I think it's also important that those of us who are parents understand that we parent through the lens of that trauma, right? And so for me, especially when we talk about emotional devaluation, one of my favorite stories to tell here is when my son was 3, we were on the phone with a family member and it was time for him to go to bed. So we were on the phone and I say to him, okay, honey, it's time to get ready for bed. And he says to me at 3, I'm angry about that. And the person we were on the phone with says, oh, y'all are some new age parents, right? Because from her perspective, the idea that this 3-year-old would have any feelings at all about going to bed was completely illogical, right? She comes from this parenting frame of, you do what I say because I do it. You don't question me. I don't care about your little feelings, right? And sometimes what we see, right, is when children do have emotional reactions, particularly if we perceive those reactions to be negative, we say things like, fix your face before I fix it for you, or stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. Which, if you think about it, I don't need anything else to cry about because I'm already crying, right? But what I'm suggesting is that it's time for us to get curious about the fact that our commitment to that frame, that children should be seen and not heard, that children don't have the full range of emotional expression, is connected to a time in our history where children had to be quiet, where they had to be silent, because that was the only way we could keep them safe. And the invitation is, in 2020, do we have to follow those same rules, or do we have some more flexibility, right? One of the intentional decisions we've made in our household is that our son will be allowed to express himself fully, even if that is irritating or off-putting for us as parents, because I don't want him to grow up and be a fully grown man who can't connect with his partner and children if he decides to have children, who doesn't know how to make sense of his own emotional world, who doesn't know how to relate to people, right? And so I can't keep him safe everywhere in the world, but he can be safe in my house, right? And so that is what it means when I say, can we tell the truth about generational trauma and then explore what it means to fight against that whenever we have opportunities to do so. We see very few opportunities for public emotional expression for Black folks, such that often when we do emote, there are accusations associated with that. Yes, you are the angry Black woman, you are the violent Black man, right? When Trayvon Martin died, I'll never forget, there was this image going around of his father at his funeral, and he was sobbing and screaming, and he was so entrenched in the throes of grief that he would have like sweat through his shirt, right? And that image went around and around social media. And one of the conclusions I came to is that part of the reason that image was so compelling is that, when do Black men have permission to be emotional creatures, and particularly in public, right? The message that Black folks get in this world is, suck it up, keep it going, don't let them see you cry. And we had to survive. Ruby Bridges, at 6 years old, walking into a school to integrate it, and grown people are yelling at her, throwing things, spitting at her. She's being escorted by the National Guard, and she's stoic, right? She's a hero, and we celebrate her for that. But it's also not normal for a 6-year-old to not emote in that situation, right? That is what generational trauma looks like. It's us celebrating the fact that a 6-year-old could enter that trauma stone-faced. Yes, she's a hero, but why was it demanded that she do it in that way? And what are the ways that we continue to participate in that unspoken rule, and sometimes spoken rule, don't feel, don't think, don't respond, right? And let's get real, kids especially do not know how to express their emotions in, quote, effective ways. The only way they understand how to regulate their emotions is if adults help them to co-regulate. But if instead of co-regulating, the adults tell them to shut it down, then we shouldn't be that surprised when we see grown-ups who engage in addictive processes and have no emotion regulation skills. When were they to learn? Right? And so that's what I mean by, let's kind of challenge this idea that this is the way it has to be. The intention is good. The intention is to protect, but sometimes the consequence is a cost that we have to decide whether or not we're willing to pay. So I'll give you another example here of emotional cutoff. The same car that thankfully I no longer have, because apparently I had lots of issues with it. There was a period of time where there was a piece on my car that didn't work. So it was in the shop at the dealership, The dealership told me it will be ready like in 3 days. And 60 days later, 60 days, 60, I still didn't have my car. And I had been paying for a rental car for 2 months. So as you can imagine, I had some feelings about this. And I was on the phone with my friend on the way to the dealership to have a discussion with the general manager about my car. And I am livid, as you can imagine. And my friend, I'm telling her, everything I'm going to say to the general manager, I'm going to let him have it, right? And my friend says to me, Jess, don't get arrested. And we laughed, right? But what she was saying was, don't forget, if you show up the way you're talking to me now, you'll show up as an angry Black woman, and we both know that will have all of these consequences, right? The message she was saying, and she never said anything more than don't get arrested, because we both knew, because the trauma is embedded in our psyches, right? The message she was sending was, you don't get to show all of what you feel. And let's just be clear, it had nothing to do with the validity of my anger, because my anger was valid. I had a right to be mad because I had kind of been, pushed around and not told the whole story. And I'd spent all this money that I didn't think I should have to spend. And let's get clear, I had the privilege to spend $1,000 on a rental car for 2 months that many people don't have, right? So there's a piece there. But what she was saying was, it doesn't matter how valid your anger is, people won't be able to hear it because of the way you'll show up. That's how emotional devaluation gets played out. And then I have to make this choice between expressing myself authentically or getting my needs met. That's an unreasonable ask. And yet we ask Black people to do it on a consistent basis, right? You can express yourself, but only if you do it in the right ways. And it's not too loud and not to this and not to that. And if you don't use too many angry words, and you have to make sure you have the right clothes, you have to make sure your hair looks nice, you have to make sure you have a clean criminal record, because only then will people be able to hear you. And so the protective mechanism is, I just won't show it. I just won't feel it, because there isn't a safe space for me to show it or feel it. The other way this plays out that I'll just touch on is secret keeping within families. That, think about the example where there might be a perpetrator of sexual violence in the family, and that perpetrator doesn't get reported because the goal might be, well, the person's okay, their feelings are hurt, but they're okay. And we don't want to send another one of us over to them, right? So the consequences here really are staggering when you think about the way that we use emotions to navigate the world. And you have a whole community of people who may feel that that process is inaccessible, at least not in full or complete ways. Yeah, secret keeping gets under my skin, and it only makes matters worse. I think you're right? But in the context of, we can't send a family member out there, right? In a context of a need to protect the family and create an insular community, it makes sense. I'm not saying it's okay, right? But it makes sense that we would see that behavior play out. And the goal is to get curious about what are our reasons behind engaging in some of these behaviors again. So how does this impact us in a general way? We are less likely to name trauma as trauma. I see this in my clinical practice all the time, that maybe we have people who've experienced multiple complex traumas, but when you ask them if they've experienced a trauma, they say no, right? Because maybe I haven't given permission to say, this was traumatic and it impacted me. We also see resilience and grit as a necessity, right? We love to celebrate Black folks for surviving. We also have to think about, what is the cost of that surviving, and how can we give people opportunities to really share, hey, I'm not okay, right? And what would that look like? This is a good question. How do we get balance? How do we balance the need to be human, to be authentic and vulnerable on the one hand, and on the other one, protect ourselves by not showing emotions to avoid being shot or locked up? I'm going to talk about that explicitly in a minute, but the short answer is we have to find spaces, and for some of us, craft and curate spaces where that can be the case, right? Because remember, we're not talking about cultural paranoia. It is a reality, and it was a reality for me dealing with that car issue, that if I showed up too loud or too angry, not only would I probably not get my issue fixed, but I might have gotten arrested. That's not outside the realm of possibility, right? But at the same time, my anger was valid, and I needed to be able to communicate my concerns, right? And so I think we have to sophisticate and nuance our survival strategies. So we'll get to that in just a minute. Another thing that we see as a protective mechanism is powerful, persistent value systems, right? 10 or 15 years ago, I would have said that those primary value systems are embedded in religiosity, and that's not so much the case anymore. I mean, Black folks as a whole are still more religious than other cultural groups, but we are certainly less religious than we were years and years ago. And so it's important to keep in mind that those values may not just be connected to a religious system. They might be connected to a cultural system. They might be connected to just a community that they're really engaged in. And so all of that is okay. As a mental health professional, how do we address a child's emotional and behavioral struggle when parents are embedding these traumatic experiences to protect them? Sure, I would say the conversation is naming that could this be a result of unresolved cultural trauma, right? And so the first piece there is the parent actually managing their own trauma reactions around their fears, right? If you talk to a Black parent, often what many of us will say is if we see our kid engaging in some kind of behavior that we see as problematic or destructive or whatever, yes, we see that behavior in the moment, but often many of us are thinking about what will be the consequences if they do this in an environment that isn't safe, or if they do it at school, or if they do it around certain kind of people, right? And so it is the work of the parents to manage their own trauma there and to build skills for pausing, for centering, for somebody said in the comments a couple minutes ago, to really choose your battles. It is about interrogating the way we were parented and getting curious about if we want to be the kind of parent that we had. For many of us, that's a complicated answer, right? And the question that I meditate a lot on as a parent, having like a strong-willed, opinionated child, is, am I raising him for freedom or for slavery? And I know that sounds like a really kind of dramatic question, but if I'm raising him for slavery, then in order to protect him, I have to prune him, mold him down to size, get really clear rules about what's okay and what's not okay, and things become very black and white. But if I'm raising him for freedom, then what I want to build is the skills for him to make decisions about the life that he wants to live. And I think that's a very, very different frame. There's a great resource for Black parents who are tackling these kinds of issues. It's a podcast called Parenting Decolonized that talks specifically about how so much of the tradition in Black parenting, honestly, is connected to this idea of generational trauma. Stacey Patton's book, Spare the Kids, Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America, also on the reference list, is another great resource. It talks specifically about cultural punishment, corporal punishment, excuse me, but it tackles this larger discussion of fear-based parenting and how we sort of produce fear in our children because of our own fear as parents, right? That one of the ways we protect our kids unknowingly on some level, right, is to make them scared, right? And so it presents some different options. But so that was a long meandering answer. The short version of that is, I think the goal is to get the parents to do their own work, to get to a place where their parenting matches their values. And sometimes when we explore that, we find that we don't, we're not doing things that match our values. We're doing things because that's what we've been taught to do, and because we're scared, and because we don't know what else to do. And that is certainly what happens when people have experienced the trauma. But part of healing from trauma is challenging that and combating that, right? Why do you feel our youth are killing one another at an alarming rate? What do you feel is needed to turn this around? So I think what you're alluding to, Valerie, is the idea of like Black on Black violence. So the first challenge there is that Black on Black violence is a made up construct, right? Because anytime violence occurs in communities, right? And so if you have people who are in a community who are of the same ethnic background, then you could have Latino on Latino violence or white on white violence, but we don't talk about that because it's not politically helpful. I do think that the violence we see, particularly in impoverished communities, is around that first component of persistent lack of safety. There's interesting research on, again, for those of you who are mental health professionals, on kids who have a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder are more likely to, in their social and emotional appraisal systems, have heightened perceptions of threat. So kids with those two diagnoses in particular, which we see a lot in community-based mental health or school-based mental health with African-American boys in particular, right? Kids with those two diagnoses, essentially somebody could say something that is benign or harmless, but they're more likely to perceive it as threatening. And what does that sound like except persistent lack of safety, right? So I think if we're going to address those threat responses and how they lead to violence, aggression, those kinds of things, we have to address the internal process that leads to people perceiving threat. I think that's a starting point, right? And part of the goal there is to get to a place where we can have conversations, right? There's all this discussion now in schools about how meditation rooms work a lot better than detention. Why? Because aggression is about emotion regulation. And if you have whole communities of people who have not had opportunities and skills around emotion regulation, then we see aggression. It's easy to look at the aggression on its face and say, these people are bad, they need to be punished. But we're actually not teaching them any skills for how to manage anger, which is a useful emotion, just like all the others, without getting to aggressive behaviors. So, something to think about. All right, so we've talked about the physical and emotional dysregulation. We've talked also about the reactivation of trauma narratives, kind of in the current reality of our world. And so the million-dollar question is, what do we do? What do we do with this? We've talked about some of this, but I just want to quickly draw your awareness to 4 suggestions that kind of come from review of the folks who are doing this work, and then a smattering of my own thoughts, just kind of working with generational trauma from a clinical perspective and also from a communal perspective. Is the encouragement is to tell the truth, to build, curate, engage in sacred spaces. And I don't mean sacred from a religious or spiritual perspective, but sacred meaning set apart, protected, safe. to attend to the body, excuse me, and to reconnect with culture. So how do we tell the truth, right? We have to recognize and name systemic racism and its impact on this country. We have to stop pretending that racism doesn't exist. We have to. We just have to. And because the longer we participate in this narrative of being in a post-racial society, the longer we re-traumatize the people who are impacted by racism on a daily basis. We have evidence. We know that if you have two people who turn in identical resumes and one of those names looks like it's a quote ethnic name and the other doesn't, the person who has the more neutral name is likely to get the job. We know that if two identical people turn in a mortgage application and one of them says they got a bachelor's degree from a historically Black university and the other one didn't, the person who got the bachelor's degree from the historically Black university is less likely to get the loan. Right? We know this. We know that Black children in school systems are disproportionately impacted by disciplinary action in ways that do not match the behaviors that they engaged in. So we have to call a thing a thing. And in this country, that means exploring the parts of history that have been forgotten or erased. That means exploring what was happening in our country when Native Americans were driven from their lands for the sake of building America. When that means acknowledging that slave labor built the executive mansion where the president resides, right? That means acknowledging that only in this country can people who would have been convicted of treason get monuments, and then people fight over those monuments. That's the country we live in. And it's not to say that it's all bad, but we've got to tell the truth, because until we recognize that people's traumatic reactions and their quote unquote paranoia is not made up, we can't deal with the issue of really addressing systemic racism head on. We have to then, once we tackle that history, be able to hold systems accountable for that transformation. So as we look at the health system, as we look at housing, as we look at education, as we look at the mental health system, what are the ways that we, the do-gooders, the helpers, have participated in these inequitable systems? And how can we begin to shift that, right? We can only hold systems accountable if we know the truth of the history and how they came to be. So that means we've got to educate ourselves. We've got to read the books. We've got to do the research. We've got to have those crucial conversations so we know what is the truth here about the world that we live in, and is that the world we want to continue to live in? Second, we need sacred spaces, set apart spaces. For folks of African ancestry, that means specifically engaging in spaces where you don't have to defend or explain, right? Many of us, maybe in our work or even in our advocacy work, right, there are times when we have to explain ourselves, explain why we feel the way we feel. And there's a time and a place for that, but there's also a time and a place for just being able to have people bear witness without having to qualify what you think or feel. So there's a question: do you think educating the African American race about their history before slavery will place value on our outlook concerning our value? Yes, I think so. Part of the what I'm going to suggest in a few minutes is that one of the things that I think will be helpful for the Black community in particular is to understand that our history in the world does not begin with slavery, right? That is not all of who we are as a people. And so I think it's important for us to reconnect both with that history, but also with the systems and values that that have fueled us in the past, right? I think even things like genealogical research can be really helpful, right? Because most African Americans, without doing some digging, maybe you can go 4 or 5 generations back, but people weren't keeping, clear documentation on slaves because they weren't even considered people, right? And so at some point, for most of us, that pathway ends. But it can be really liberating, right? Just as it can be liberating for a person of Irish or British ancestry to be able to trace their heritage 15 generations back to the original family seal, it could be liberating for us as African Americans to trace our family heritage 14 or 15 generations back to the country in West Africa where our people originated, right? And so those kinds of things I think can be very powerful. One of the things that can also be helpful is to engage in spaces where values are articulated clearly and plainly. What I mean by that is there's a psychology construct called a null environment. And we use it in particular when we're talking about people who are in like marginalized communities or people who are new to an environment. And basically a null environment is one where you don't really know what people think or feel about you. I challenge churches around this a lot when we're talking about LGBTQ issues. Like if a gay person were walking your church, do they know? Like, do they think that you are affirming or not? Or do they have no idea? And so null environments can be particularly stressful for people in marginalized communities because now there's mental energy around trying to figure out, am I safe here or not? So a sacred space then could be a place where you don't have to ask those questions, because now that energy that you might have spent trying to figure things out, you can spend engaging in community, building connections, doing something else. And that looks like finding providers who understand culture, whether it's a medical provider or a mental health provider. It also looks like sometimes taking breaks from the news, from social media, right? If anytime there's a new video of a person getting shot, I know I'm going to spend a couple of days off of social media, because there's no world in which it's helpful to me to watch somebody else dying over and over again, and then to look in the comments of that social media post and have other people say why the person should have been killed. And so maybe that sacred space is in my mind or in my home where I give myself permission to take a break from the reality. It won't go away, right? As soon as I walk out my door, as soon as I go to work, it will come and accompany me again. But I can set hard boundaries so that my rest time, my rejuvenation time, my sleeping time is not taken up with things that I can't fix right now in the moment, right? For some of us, those sacred spaces are around activism and community building and advocacy, right? It's about a need to act, to do something, to have an impact in the world. What have I found helpful in caring for yourself as you walk this personally and professionally? Yeah, so I think I'm talking about some of that. I don't spend a lot of time watching the news. I have a podcast that I listen to that's 15 minutes of news every morning, and that's my cap. I when I'm doing this kind of work, for instance, especially depending on how I think the crowd might be, I might kind of decide how much time I'm going to spend engaging after the fact. One of the ways that's helpful to me is that my sacred spaces are often in literature. And so I read a lot of Black writers. I was really thrown by Breonna Taylor's death in a way that kind of surprised me, honestly. And so one of my projects over the summer has been rereading Toni Morrison, because her work is certainly a sacred space for me. And so, I'm making some suggestions, but I think at the end of the day, it's about us all honoring and attending to ourselves. And so the strategies look different. And frankly, even that is resistance, because so often the combinations of racism and capitalism and individualism in this country make it so that Black folks are often oriented toward work, toward productivity, toward having some product that you can give. And it is a gift and an act of resistance to just look inward and spend some time doing just what I want to do, even if that doesn't produce an outward product in the world, if that makes sense. I also, for me, frankly, part of one of the ways I cope is by doing this kind of educative, and advocacy work, right? Because I think because of the spaces I've been in, and frankly, because when I'm the trainer, I have a position of power, I can have conversations with people that maybe other folks who look like me can't have. That because I'm Dr. Brown, people will listen to me and at least get curious about what I have to say. And so when I walk into a room, I think about the fact that maybe I'm paving a way for a client or a student who doesn't have the words to advocate for themselves in that way. But if I had that conversation and came before them, maybe the journey will be a little lighter for them, right? And so that for me is something that's personally meaningful and is a gift in the midst of, frankly, how terrible the world can be sometimes, right? A second strategy is to attend to the body, right? We talked about the fact that trauma produces a bodily response, that hypervigilance means that that bodily response is chronic and destructive over time. And so often for Black folks, illness is not just illness, right? Illness is a manifestation of trauma. Illness is a manifestation of pain, emotional pain, of communal suffering, right? And so we can use our bodies to explore our emotions, but we can also be vigilant and intentional about caring for our bodies, right? Somatic self-care, exercise, nutrition, water, but also stretching, baths, right? Spending time caring for our body as a way to reverse the weathering that comes from living in this world in a Black body, right? When I think about going out in the world and having this awareness that maybe because I show up as a brown person, my body is devalued, is thought less than, is thought threatening, then it is an act of resistance to care for and cater to that body, right? To allow myself an opportunity to rest, to allow myself an opportunity to just be without an agenda, right? And so that piece is really important. So there's a question, am I HBCU educated? No, I didn't actually attend HBCUs for schooling, but I teach at an HBCU now, right? And so certainly a part of my frame is this awareness of what it means to be in Black community as a sacred space. That for me came later in life because I didn't make that choice as an undergraduate. I think I'm hopeful that my son will attend an HBCU, right? Because I think there's something important about extending that sacred space and that sense of home into early adulthood that, my experience was different, not necessarily bad, but certainly different. And I highly value my role as a member of an HBCU community now. So that's something that's really important to me. Okay, the governor has placed in legislation, I believe, to teach African American history in some high schools in certain cities in Virginia. What's your perspective of it being taught as soon as pre-K through middle school, especially history that predates slavery? This is a really interesting question. So I think it is always beneficial to a community to learn about the history of all communities. I think it's a good idea to teach African American history in schools. As a parent, I won't ever be dependent upon a school to teach my son about Black history, right? So I think for me, I hold that responsibility, and whatever he gets at school is extra. My husband and I make choices about what books he reads and the kind of TV he's allowed to watch and the conversations that we have, and talking openly about what it means for us to be brown people, because ultimately we think that's our responsibility to do that. But I think it's always a good idea to give people more education. Is the question about this earlier around reconnecting with history, especially history pre-slavery? I think one of the things that Black folks in particular can do is to reconnect with all of our culture, right? We tend to, the part of our history that is most often taught in this country is the bad stuff, like all the suffering and the trials and tribulations, right? And that's a part of our history, but it's not all of who we are. And so I think it can be helpful for us to think about, yes, ways that we've been resilient, ways that we have been strong and have kept going, but also to acknowledge that there is more to us than the struggle. I think often in this country, we are defined by the struggle, but it's not all of who we are. And so connecting with African cultural and religious systems, with Afrocentric frameworks for understanding parenting or family, those of us who have the means, returning to the continent, and experiencing another version of home. I was joking with a client the other day that I think it was I can't remember the title of the person who's in upper level leadership in the West African country of Ghana, but she basically put out a statement that was like, y'all come back, repatriate, right? And for many of us, maybe that's the answer, right? To return to a home that loves us instead of a home that hates us, right? And again, that's kind of dichotomous language, but it's something to think about, and really to examine and interrogate survival coping. So think about our conversation about parenting earlier, right? One of the keys for those of us who are descendant from communities that experience generational trauma is to explore, when I do this thing, am I doing it because I think it's the right thing to do? And or could this strategy be one that that really is perpetuating a trauma that I'm attempting to heal from, right? And what would it mean if I got curious about some other ways I could heal? Okay, I work at a hospital. How can we help patients who have mistrust in the medical system while encouraging attending to the body? Again, I think it's tell the truth, right? And so maybe it is to say, look, I understand why you might mistrust. What questions do you have that I could help address for you? Or are there particular providers that you might be more interested in? Now, I know that's not always the case at a hospital, right? But I think often just having the conversation helps to let people know, I don't think you're being unreasonable. I'm not trying to dismiss you. I'm just trying to help you, right? And that means, though, for those of us who are providers, is giving people the opportunity to ask all the questions that they have, to express their distrust, because that's a part of what helps people to feel more comfortable. not just about the Black children, but the children of other races should learn all about the contributions that Black Americans have made to medicine and so on. I think that's the case with any kind of marginalized community, right? It would be my preference that my son learns about Black history, learns about Latino history, learns about Native American history, right? Because for me, that's one of the ways we combat this self-focused egocentrism that perpetuates some of the things that we're seeing in our country right now. It's important for all of us, if we're going to live in an integrated society, to get over the fact that it's not just about us, but it's about other people too, right? And if we're really going to coexist in the society that we want to believe is real, then we've got to learn about everybody, right? And that, I think that is our collective work. Okay, what's your thoughts on the governor saying we will attempt to teach a more accurate history instead of teaching the entire true history? The governor's a politician, right? And so anytime you have folks who are in politics, their responsibility is to an entire state, and their language, I think, leads to sometimes what some of us might consider, weaker language, or from their perspective, it might be inclusivity. So, I understand the need to play the game, so to speak. And for me, I'm less concerned about words than I am about actions. So for any politician, for any government agency, for any political appointee, for any county-based board, for me, the goal is, do your actions line up with your stated values? Period. So that's my perspective. I think I know that for other people, the words of politicians set the stage. And so I understand that people will take issue. The reality is that politicians serve at the pleasure of the public, and they're never going to make everybody happy. So they try to do what they can to make as many people happy as possible. I get it. Yeah. So those are the suggestions that I have, right? We've had kind of a fruitful discussion in the Q&A. I think we have a couple more minutes if there are other questions that people want to ask, but I want to draw your attention. You will get the slides. I want to draw your attention to the reference list. Yes, you will get the slides. I want to draw your attention to the reference list. Here is the Joy DeGruy book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing. It's an excellent resource. The two hyperlinked resources are specifically related to the dual pandemic piece. One is a blog post from a mental health professional. The other is directly from the Centers for Disease Control, which I think outlines some of the discussions that we've been having, but potentially goes into more depth. So if you are in the camp of folks who's asking, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Definitely check out Joy DeGruy work. Another resource that I want to draw your attention to is Resmaa Menakem's My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Healing Our Hearts and Bodies. He is also a social worker by training, and I think he does a fantastic job of talking about how racialized trauma impacts everyone, not just people who are in marginalized communities. And he talks specifically about how to, because trauma impacts the body, resides in the body, gets held in the body, that we use the body as a pathway to healing, right? And it goes back to that attending to the body that we talked about a little bit. For those of you who are asking parenting questions, Stacey Patton's Spare the Kids is a great resource to get started. For those of you who are doing faith-based work, Paula Owens Parker's Roots Matter is an excellent resource. The other parenting resource is the podcast called Parenting Decolonized. If you are on Facebook, Yolanda Williams is one of the founders of that work, and she also has a Facebook group specifically for Black parents. So that's another resource too. But the podcast is excellent, excellent, excellent. And she also, has other electronic resources that she has available. For those of you who are really interested in how the body gets entrenched in all this trauma, one of the seminal works, of course, for those of us who are in the mental health field, is The Body Keeps the Score. So hopefully these resources are helpful to you. This is really just to get you started. It's to get the juices flowing for you, to be able to say that, okay, this is something that I've heard about and want to think some more about, but this certainly is not the end all be all, right? This is just a primer. And so I hope that the conversation has been helpful to you all and that you've gotten something out of it. And I want to thank you so much for your engagement in the discussion.